Hello, everyone. Um, I have decided for this week to do two shorter lectures on the content for this week, which is the Second Temple, the context of the Second Temple period for the New Testament, which includes some overview of the Greco-Roman period. What I mean by that is um, the Greek period extending from the conquest of Alexander the Great up to the Roman Empire um, and domination of Judea in 63 BCE. So when I say Greco-Roman period, this is this is a common term in the scholarly discourse for discussing, discussing a wide range of years, um, in which there was a lot of important events in Judaism that that lay the backdrop for the new writing of the New Testament texts and the events that took place in Jesus's life, the lives of his followers, and in the later writers of the New Testament text. So this lecture is going to focus on the world behind the text, right? So when you open your Bible and you're reading the New Testament, there's a relationship that's developing, and I'll talk more about this in another video. When you're reading the text, there's our world, everything that contributes to our identity. In my case, I'm a privileged white male, and so that shapes my world and the way what I bring to the text. So I have to be aware of that. There's also the text itself, right? And then we talk about the world behind the text, the historical context that shaped the writers, the editors, and of the text and the way that they thought about their world. And so this lecture is focusing on that world behind the text, the Greco-Roman world behind the text. And for those of us in the Christian tradition who are reading the New Testament, it's important to note this is all taking place, the events of Jesus's life, the life of Paul, and Paul's writings certainly are taking place within the context of Second Temple Judaism, which is the period of the Second Temple. So, and we'll see this in a few slides here. The time when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in 536, 537 BCE. And then the Persians later allowed the temple to be rebuilt, and we call that the Second Temple. And the Second Temple stood until 70 CE, when the Romans put down the Jewish revolt, the first Jewish revolt, by laying siege to Jerusalem and destroying that temple. So Judaism in the Second Temple period, we're talking about, again, a wide range of years, but it's important to talk about this to understand the texts that we are reading in the New Testament. So this lecture is going to specifically focus on the Greco-Roman context. It is not comprehensive. It's not meant to be super long. You can find more information, more detailed information in the course texts in the readings for this week, specifically Martin Goodman's piece in the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Another short lecture, I'll put together another short lecture that details more specifically the different kinds of Jews that we can expect to meet in the New Testament and in the broader context of Jesus's day. It's easy to gloss over whenever the New Testament references the Jews and to think of them as a monolith, as a whole, when in fact historical evidence suggests that it really should be Judaisms, plural. There are many forms of Judaism in Jesus's day and in Paul's day. So I'll spend another lecture shorter lecture talking about that. So let's begin here. So why Second Temple Judaism? Why study this? You can't understand the New Testament without understanding Judaism in the Second Temple period. We're not talking about Christians in the New Testament. When we talk about Jesus, we talk about Paul, we are talking about human beings whose identity was thoroughly Jewish, the way that they thought about their world, the way that they taught, their expectations for the future, their religious practice, their traditions, thoroughly Jewish. So in order to approach the New Testament, we need to keep this in view. It's vital that we keep this in view. Dr. Straight, in a previous video, stated that the more Jewish your exegesis is, the more accurate your exegesis is of the New Testament. So this is a major shift in New Testament studies over the last 40 years or so. It's very important that we emphasize the Jewish nature of these texts. There are central theological concepts in Christianity that mean absolutely nothing without the Judaism that preceded it, and specifically the Judaism of the Second Temple period, in which many of these theological concepts were developed over a period of time. Things like resurrection, the idea of bodily resurrection in the Messianic age. This is thoroughly a Jewish concept. I spoke in last week's video about apocalypticism and the genre of apocalypse, the worldview that informs the idea that present suffering and oppression will not stand, but rather that a new age will break in suddenly and radically change things for the better. This concept of apocalypticism, this is thoroughly Jewish. Exodus and exile theology, the concept of a new Moses, right? How does this and the Exodus story, the theology surrounding the Exodus story and deliverance from liberation from oppression, how does this factor into various conceptions of salvation in the New Testament? How does the figure of Moses as liberator, as lawgiver, how does that factor into New Testament theology? The ideology of Zion, which should be distinguished from Zionist ideology today, although such ideology today is also more complex than it's made out to be. But the idea of Jerusalem as the center of a sacred, holy community where God's peace and justice reigns, and where all people from around the world flock to this sacred center and are accepted and exist in peace. This idea of Zion, the purified temple, the place where God resides and is venerated. This is thoroughly Jewish. Eschatological restoration of Israel. Again, this is similar to apocalypticism, but this idea of an age to come. What comes after the present? You can't understand this in Christian theology without understanding Second Temple Judaism. And then finally, I want to mention the Septuagint, which is otherwise known as the Greek Old Testament. I could probably spend an entire lecture talking about the Septuagint, but the Septuagint there's a great story around this of Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, which in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE was a vibrant center for Jewish life. Um, um, one of the kings of Egypt basically says that he wants to have the Jewish law in his library, the famous Library of Alexandria. And so he does this by summoning a cohort of 70 Jewish scribes and teachers of the law from Jerusalem, and brings it, pays for them to come down to Egypt to sit and translate the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew into Greek. Now, is this a historical reality? It's hard to say. Most likely not. But somehow in Egypt and Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE, the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek. And the important thing about this is that when you're reading the New Testament, when there's any citation of the Old Testament, it's going to be a reference to the Septuagint, to the Greek Old Testament. So keep that in mind. The Septuagint was a literary accomplishment of significance in this period, and until the Latin versions of the Old Testament come along, the Septuagint was the way that the early Christians, that was their access to sacred scriptures. When they talk about the sacred writings, they are talking about the Greek Old Testament. Continuing with, why study Second Temple Judaism? The literary culture that produced the New Testament. Talked a little bit about the bookish culture in my last lecture, and the writings that early Christians produced. This is an extension of a vibrant Jewish literary culture during this period. I like to point out to students that there are more writings that didn't make it into our Bible. There are more writings that didn't make it into our Bible than what is there, right? There's a whole body of apocrypha, so it's called like hidden writings. And we could go through all of these. You can look these up in various biblical canon lists, I should say. There's pseudepigrapha, a host of writings that are written by authors who purport to be another author to give the writing a sense of status, but these are nonetheless widely read, even though they didn't make it into our canon. The Jewish philosopher Philo, who wrote some very important works, combining his Jewish identity, the Jewish religion, with the philosophical lingua franca of the day. So he's really making a case for Judaism to be taken seriously among a secular, and that's anachronistic to say a secular and non-Jewish audience. And then, of course, the Jewish historian Josephus, from whom we have a lot of information during this period. He's probably the primary literary source for cobbling together the history of this period. All of these writings take place in the Second Temple period. Sometimes you'll hear scholars, or a lot of times Christian pastors, refer to an intertestamental period. This is a terrible term. Not only does it rely on the fact that the Hebrew Bible canon as it is today, and for us ending with Malachi, the prophet Malachi, the book of Malachi, not only does it assume that that was in place at the time, but it also assumes that there was no, that Jews did not produce any writings or literature until the time of Jesus, that Judaism died off and was dead or dormant. And then Jesus came along, and that's the new thing. that's a terrible way of viewing the Second Temple period. So I bring this up to say, some of the older scholarship will mention intertestamental period. That don't ever use that phrase. It's anachronistic, and it erases Jewish identity in a way that has been harmful and has had harmful effects even to this day. So we don't talk about an intertestamental period. We talk about it, the Second Temple period of Judaism, in which many writings, it's a vibrant period of literature, of literary production. So this period between 515 BCE and 70 CE solidifies a strong yet diversely interpreted Jewish identity centered around Torah, temple, land, and a coming messianic age. So then the question would be, how then does Jesus and the movement that came to be associated with him figure within this context? That's what we want to think about. I've put together this timeline that looks really complicated because it is. Jewish history during this time is complicated. I just want to highlight some of it for you here. This is extending from the 6th century BCE. You can see that on the left side of your screen, all the way up until the 5th century CE on your right. Okay, and in that bar at the top, I have listed the kind of the empire that's ruling over Judea at this time. So the Persians conquer the Babylonians in 539. Now recall that Babylon had conquered Judea, and in 586, 587 had destroyed, tore down the Jerusalem temple and took into exile the elite and the ruling classes, the literate classes of Judea, took them to Babylon. Okay. Fast forward roughly 50 years, the Persians conquer Babylon, and Cyrus makes an edict to allow Jerusalem and the temple to be rebuilt, and this happens in 515. Okay, so the Second Temple is rebuilt in 515, and you've got the activity of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's the Hebrew way of saying it. Nehemiah, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So there you have Persian rule, and then you have, in 332, Alexander the Great conquers Persia and a great many places around the Mediterranean. He notoriously dies very early on. He's like in his early 30s, I think. He dies in 323. And as you can imagine, a single person who is overseeing a vast empire and suddenly dies with no plan of how to delegate or no succession stipulations is a recipe for chaos. So after that, you have some of his generals, notably Ptolemy and Seleucus, who battle it out for the various regions of Alexander's empire. And so during this period, you have Hellenistic rule over Judea, but specifically, Judea goes from Egyptian rule or Ptolemaic rule, and then during the period of 301 to 198, you have no fewer than 6 various battles, 6 various attempts by Syria or the Seleucids to wrest control of Judea from Egypt. Okay, if I were to show you a map, that would have been a good idea. If I were to show you a map of this region, you would have Seleucid rule or Syria in the north, and you would have Egypt in the south, and along the Mediterranean Sea, on the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea, you have Judea. The main thoroughfare then between Syria and Egypt is this land of Judea. And so if you control that land, you control a valuable piece of geography And that's located along the Mediterranean coast. So even extending back, Persians, Babylonians, the Assyrians, this piece of land has been valuable just for where it is situated. It should be noted that when the Seleucids take control of Judea, there's only a very short period until the ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes does something terrible. There's the Edict of Antiochus IV in 167 BCE. And essentially what Antiochus is trying to do is eradicate Jewish identity. Notoriously, he converts the Jewish temple into a pagan shrine. He notoriously goes into the temple, erects a statue of Zeus, or an altar to Zeus, and offers a pig on it. So if you can imagine, for Jews of this period, for whom pork is anathema, right? You don't go near pork. And your temple has no image to your God because you fundamentally do not believe your God should be put into an image. It's referred to as the desecrating sacrilege. You can read about this in the books of 1 and 2 Maccabees. Okay. Antiochus also outlaws various Jewish ancestral practices, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and festival observances. Okay, it's not a good time for the Jews, and it sparks the Maccabean revolt in 169. So from the period of 169 to 164, Judah Maccabeus ends up fighting the Seleucids through guerrilla warfare and defeats them, and famously purifies and rededicates the temple. And this is where the tradition of Hanukkah comes from. Hanukkah meaning rededication. From there, I have in red, you can see from 142 to 163, okay, so for a period of about 120 years, I'm sorry, a period of 80 years, roughly 80 years, the Jews have independent rule, and they're ruled under what we call the Hasmoneans, which is really an extension of the Maccabean dynasty. That eventually comes to an end with Rome conquering Judea in 63 BC. And yeah, I'm skipping over a lot of history with the Hasmoneans. There's a lot that could be said about that. But I want you to just get the idea. We've gone from Persian rule to Hellenistic rule under Egypt and Syria, a brief period of political autonomy with the Hasmoneans, and then the Romans come in, they establish Judea as a client state. And from there, things spiral down until Rome eventually makes Judea a province. And you have a number of inept rulers from there who do things that provoke the Jews to respond either violently or to just cause a situation where Jews have to wrestle with how to be Jewish and how not to be killed. And when you think it through a colonial lens, what that means for a person, the trauma of that experience cannot be overlooked and cannot be overstated. This culminates in the first Jewish revolt of 66 to 70, and that ends with the temple being destroyed in 70. I don't have it on here, but there is a second Jewish revolt, which you can read about in the Goodman reading, and that lasts from 132 to 135. It's prompted by Emperor Hadrian seeking to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony. And Simon Bar Kokhba is the figure that leads this revolt, and it is put down eventually in 135. Jerusalem is renamed Aelia Capitolina, and Judea is renamed Syria Palestina. Okay. So this is just a broad timeline that you can look at for this period. So Jews under empire, just to put this in a concise form. In the Old Testament, we read about exile in Exodus, okay? And so the Jews are in exile in Egypt. Later on, they come under Assyrian rule in the 8th to 7th century BCE. They then come under Babylonian rule, Persian rule, Greek rule, and right, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. There's a brief interlude where they have some autonomy, but then it's not long until Rome comes in and they are living under empire again. So just to put this in perspective, if you are Jewish during this period and you claim to have ancestry extending back to Israel, look at the foreign rule under which you and your people have lived for such a period of time. We have to keep this in mind as we're reading these texts. Jews under empire are subjected to imperial hegemony, taxation, military occupation, contempt for Jewish religious practice, inept and corrupt local leadership. You're exposed to foreign religions, so to the in your place, your homeland, which is idolatrous, and you have to navigate the difficulty of assimilation, whether you assimilate to the reigning imperial culture or whether you resist it in various ways. To get a view of Roman social stratification, you can see this. Let me move my video up. You can see this sociological graph. This is put together by a sociologist named Lenski. And you can see at the very top, with the most power and privilege is the ruler or the emperor. You have some functionaries in that court, in that office. And then you come down at that bulge towards the bottom, where the largest portion are peasants, merchants, artisans, and then you get down to classes where slaves exist, which is not. When you read about in Smith and Kim, there's a chapter on slavery in the New Testament in this period. So the thing to note here is that the majority of people in Roman society exist at the bottom of society. And this is certainly true for Jews. Some of them enjoy some privilege. There are ruling classes, but ultimately the amount of autonomy even those people have is limited, and it's definitely limited for the peasant class. This is a society that's pantheistic, right? It's oriented around many gods whose images are everywhere, and whose festivals are celebrated regularly every year. Essentially, Jews are living in a place, in a space where space and time are oriented around gods that are not their own. The way gender and class and race and ethnicity are organized in Roman society is very hierarchical. You have the paterfamilias, so the father's house, right? Men, and specifically landowning men, have greater privilege than women, obviously, and lower classes of men. Citizens have much more power and privilege than non-citizens, even though this empire is spread over a vast area. But we want to think about what is a Jewish response in this context? Do Jews accommodate to this? Do they exercise violence, like in the various revolts? Maccabean revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jewish revolt in 66 to 70. Do you flee? Do you leave Judea altogether? Do you come up with some creative form of resistance, maybe through writing, through various writings? How do Jews contend with this setting? And ultimately, in the Second Temple period, as a Jew, you are thinking, okay, there's an old and the present age where you live under oppression. Death is always lurking or imminent. Taxation, suffering, brokenness. This is not a world that you want to live in. And theologically, you have this messianic expectation of a Messiah that comes, in some instances, violently, definitely suddenly. And I should say that in Second Temple Judaism, there's not just one idea of a Messiah. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are texts that talk about 2 and sometimes 3 different messiahs at a time. So, but the concept of a messianic age that's going to break this cycle of death and oppression, and bring about a new age of autonomy, peace, justice, and wholeness. This is forefront in Jewish expectations during this period. So please go ahead and read the readings for this week. You'll get a much broader picture of Second Temple Judaism and the political, historical, and socio-religious context of this period. But please do, as always, reach out with any questions you might have about this. Peace.